Day 11 of testimony resumed today in the Derek Chauvin murder trial. The former Minneapolis police officer is accused of killing George Floyd in May of last year. Prosecutors started today where they left off last week with more medical testimony about George Floyd's death and autopsy. They are trying to establish Floyd died from a lack of oxygen, a result of Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck for more than 9 minutes. The defense, meanwhile, has another narrative. They claim Floyd's drug use and a weak heart led to his death. Today's first witness was Dr. Jonathan Rich, a cardiologist who analyzed and wrote a detailed report on the cause of Floyd's death.
In this case, Mr. George Floyd died from a cardiopulmonary arrest. It was caused by low oxygen levels, and those low oxygen levels were induced by the prone restraint and positional asphyxiation that he was subjected to. I can state with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from a drug overdose.
George Floyd's brother also took the stand today. An emotional Philonis Floyd said his big brother always looked out for him and his siblings.
He was so much of a leader to us in the household. He will always make sure that we had our clothes for school. He made sure that we all were going to be to school on time. And like I told you, George couldn't cook, but he'll make sure you have a snack or something to get in the morning. But he was one of those people in the community that when they had church outside, people would attend church just because he was there.
For more, let's bring in Jenny Roberts. She's the co-director of the Criminal Justice Clinic and a professor of law at American University. She's also a former public defender. Jenny, welcome. Great to have you with us. So what are your initial thoughts on today's testimony?
Well, Dr. Rich was clear. He was definitive. He was very comprehensive in a way that I think jurors, certainly I could understand on the medical evidence. He didn't change his opinion on cross-examination. And he said some things that I think were pretty devastating to the defense's theory that either a drug overdose or heart damage caused death. So he said there's absolutely no evidence of heart damage. And he was really detailed on how the heart compensates for things like narrowing and blockage, things that were seen in Mr. Floyd, and that Mr. Floyd's heart would have compensated for that, and he was not at a big risk for a heart attack. A couple of other pretty devastating things. He said, I believe George Floyd would have lived but for the 9 minutes under Chauvin's knee. And he also said Derek Chauvin could have saved his life, Mr. Floyd's life. And I'm sure the other police officers are watching very intently because, of course, this applies to them, too, in their future trials.
Right. Yeah, he noted certain periods or points in the proceedings where Derek Chauvin's life could have been saved or potentially could have been saved, that those crucial moments that were passed over.
That's right. And I would expect that kind of testimony to resurface if there are trials of the other officers. They're charged. They can plead guilty or they can go to trial. So I would expect that to resurface. The other thing that really stuck out for me with Dr. Rich's testimony was at the very end, I believe it was on recross examination, Chauvin's lawyer asked something to this effect. So if George Floyd had gotten in the squad car, he would have survived, right? I thought that was a pretty awful choice, awful thing to say, but also a really bad strategic choice, not relevant, kind of hurts the defense case to really be raising that and trying to shift blame in that sort of irrelevant way. But that pretty much sums up this witness for the defense. Very tough witness for the defense.
Right. Right. So testimony, of course, resumes after an evening of unrest in Brooklyn Center, which is a suburb just north of Minneapolis, after another black man, as you know, was fatally shot by police yesterday. And Jenny, the judge presiding over the Chauvin case declined to sequester the jury. Why not? And is this the correct decision on his part?
Well, I guess we'll know if it's the correct decision if there is any kind of appeal on this basis. But judges do, under Minnesota law, have, like in other jurisdictions, a lot of discretion about whether or not to sequester. I mean, at the end of the day, it's really about whether the jurors can continue to be fair if they're allowed to go home and have access to media. Of course, they're already isolated during the day. They're not supposed to be watching media about this case. But if there's no showing that any jurors were affected by exposure to media or to their family, then the judge probably did make the right decision. It is expensive to sequester. It's very hard to get and keep jurors on sequestered trials. That's why sequestration is so unusual.
Right. And so if you are the defense, what angle are you trying to get across to the jury this week? Last week, we heard a lot about Mr. Floyd's drug use. Can we expect the same or a similar approach this week?
Well, it's always hard to say what the defense strategy will be until the prosecution's case ends. But certainly, I think two things are clear from what we've heard so far by cross-examination. One is that the defense is trying to undermine the government's claim that Derek Chauvin was the cause of death here. The other is that this force was unreasonable force. Those are two things that the defense might be trying to sort of undermine here. It's really important to remember that defendants in a criminal case have no burden. The burden is always on the government. The government has to prove each and every element of each and every charge beyond a reasonable doubt. And so it's important, it's a little bit of a tightrope walk for the defense lawyer to undermine those one or more elements without sort of taking on a burden of proving anything themselves on these core elements.
Right. Okay. So as a former public defender, what will you be keeping your eye on the most in the coming days? Is there something you think can change the trajectory of this trial dramatically?
It's very hard to imagine the trajectory of this trial changing. I think this is an extremely tough case for any defense attorney, very hard case to defend. I'm frankly a lot more interested in keeping my eye on beyond this trial. Because frankly, as a defense lawyer, watching police officers testify against other police officers has been really surreal. And my question is that going to happen again down the line? Watching prosecutors vigorously prosecuting a police officer when in many earlier cases we know this did not happen is surreal. And so I want to see further down the line what's going to happen.
So do you think this means the end of the blue wall of silence, or do you think that just is indicative of how strong this particular prosecution's case is?
I would hope it means the end of what has been a very harmful blue wall of silence for this country. But I can't say that I'm confident in that, and only time will tell.
All right. Well, Jenny Roberts, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your insight.